So, We Choosing America is a book about the years after 9/11, and it explores the experiences of immigrant communities who are South Asian, Muslim, Arab, and Sikh who have lived in and confronted the discrimination and violence that we've seen in post 9/11 America. And I wrote the book because when the attacks of 9/11 happened, I was an attorney at the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice. And I recall at the time going through a process of double grieving for what had happened on that day, the victims of those horrific attacks, and also grieving for the fact, the inevitability, that our country would turn on people who were from my communities, who look like people in my families, who resemble people in neighborhoods I grew up in, and would turn on those folks. And so the book really is a result of my work in post 9/11 communities over the past 15 years or so. And I have always felt that we have a sanitized understanding of the experiences of these communities in post 9/11 America. In classes I've taught, I've noticed that students have a very incomplete understanding of what it means to be Muslim or South Asian or Sikh in this particular environment. And so the book tells stories, it shares policy recommendations, it places a historical perspective around some of the issues that we talk about even today, and it provides people with some tools to take action in their communities. Well, so much of my work has been in the South Asian American community, and I ran an organization called SALT, South Asian Americans Leading Together, which is a national nonprofit advocacy organization that speaks up on civil and immigrant issues facing South Asians here in the United States. South Asians happen to be actually the fastest growing ethnic group in the country. And I found during my work at SALT that it was so important for us to address the issues that our communities faced. So whether it was around immigration or hate violence or civil rights, but it was also important for us to build bridges with other communities of color and to understand that anything that affects other communities is also affecting us. So my interest in thinking about and understanding solidarity practice comes from that experience of how do we reach out and build bridges? How do we actually engage in transformative solidarity rather than transactional solidarity? And so I've been working on some projects and some ideas and learning from a lot of people around the country about how they actually engage in that work on a day-to-day basis and the long-term implications for what it means for equity and for justice in our country. Well, I think that writing a book at some level probably goes back to my own education in the humanities. I was an English major in college a very long time ago and really understood the power of the written word from a literary standpoint. I studied post-colonial literature, and so to understand how characters and stories were told through the construct of imperialism and colonialism, and how those power structures continue to affect communities today is something that really resonated with me. And as many English majors are wont to do, I went to law school. And during my law school education, I started to really interrogate some of the ways in which our communities of color and immigrants were still marginalized by the legal system. And so for me, writing a book, I think, goes back to my early education as an English major in college, understanding the power of the written word, and really wanting to convey stories in a different format. So I think that all forms of media are absolutely important, and I know that with the book that I've written on post 9/11 America, there are documentaries and other forms of storytelling that could be coupled with that book to really give people a very comprehensive understanding of what it means to live in post 9/11 America. Right now, I think as all of us know, we're living through a very transformative moment when it comes to the country's changing racial landscape. By the time we hit 2042, our country will be a nation where people of color make up the majority population. And that will be the first time in the history of our country that that's the case. So I think it's incumbent upon us, especially also young people who will inherit this America, to really start thinking about how do we talk about race and racism and other forms of oppression in ways that actually center justice and equity and solidarity, rather than just diversity and multiculturalism. Because I think those have been sort of our go-to responses around race and racism and race relations in this country for far too long. But they're not enough. They're starting points. But clearly, if you have, say, a diverse classroom, that doesn't necessarily mean that students of color or students from lower socioeconomic statuses actually have access to the educational system, right? And so how are we actually going beyond diversity to talk about equity, justice, and solidarity? I think those questions have to be asked and interrogated and answered as we think about the changing racial landscape. And I think for many people, those questions are becoming even more exacerbated because of the current political environment. We're in an environment right now where we're seeing a lot of threats to the livelihoods, to the rights of people of color, immigrants, queer and trans communities, and many others. So it's really important that we get a handle on being courageous about having conversations about race and other forms of oppression, that we don't try to paint some of these issues over by just talking about diversity and multiculturalism, that we really look at our institutions and systems and policies and practices and understand how we can make the changes that we need to in order to make sure we're living in a more equitable and inclusive society. So I think that one of the ways in which we'll see a narrative emerge, and it's been emerging for some time, is a scarcity narrative around what is available in this country, right? So what happens is when you think, well, I don't have enough, or there are all these immigrants coming in and they might take what I have, or they're going to change what is sort of the mythical America, which doesn't really truly exist. But when you come from that sort of standpoint, it's very easy to have this divide and conquer method where even immigrants are pitted against each other or communities of color are pitted against each other. One example that I think a lot of people are familiar with is this idea of the model minority narrative, where oftentimes Asian Americans are lifted up as being Silicon Valley entrepreneurs or spelling bee champions. And they're said to be the, quote, model minority. They are educated, they have jobs, they're successful. But this particular myth is a way to actually pit communities against each other in that divide and conquer framework. And the message it sends to Black and Latinx communities is, well, Asian Americans seem to be doing well. They don't seem to be needing benefits or services or affirmative action or any of these other types of ways we've talked about racial equity. So why do you? And so it's very important that we recognize these dangerous myths, that we're able to dismantle them, and that we're not pitting communities against each other. So cross-group solidarity is extremely important because it allows us to come together. But it also has to be something that's real, right? I think that a lot of us are used to sort of holding up signs, right? Black Lives Matter, or white people for Black Lives Matter, or Asian Americans against white supremacy. And those are important. Showing those sorts of messages and demonstrating in those ways are absolutely important. But I think what we also need to do is to actually have those courageous conversations to understand each other's own histories and stories of oppression and resistance, and really work through some of the biases that we have towards each other, and then to understand how we can dismantle the various ways in which racism plays itself out. I think that for social change movements, one of the biggest challenges that we have is that we're siloed in many ways, and that we're not necessarily talking to each other. And I think it's really important that these conversations happen at the local level, the neighborhood level, the campus level, and not just at sort of the national level, where they usually tend to happen. I also think that we have to make sure that we're centering those who are most affected when we're talking about social change movements. Oftentimes, we have leaders who speak for communities, or we have sort of the cult of the celebrity activist. And we really need to be able to ensure that there are opportunities for people who are affected, say by the Muslim ban and the refugee ban, or by raids and deportations, to share their stories if they choose to, and to also guide how a particular movement or a policy approach should actually be implemented. In many ways, when you look at American society, social change movements have been what has created change. So when you look at the civil rights movement, or you look at the movement for indigenous rights, or for the Me Too movement, which is actually taking shape right now, you can see that these are the social change movements that really allow people to interrogate what's happening in their workplaces and in their communities and even in their families, and to make those sorts of changes. So we need to see more of that. Opportunities for these movements, I think that social media and being in the digital world is actually extremely important, because it allows us to break these silos down and break the barriers down. And it allows people to connect with each other across time and space, and to actually identify unifying principles and get going on actions in their local communities. Right now, I am really excited about pursuing some of the outcomes of the Solidarity Project I'm part of. So I host a monthly podcast on solidarity practice. I also work closely with activists around the country who are engaging in transformative messages and actions that build these unifying messages across groups. And I'm eager to understand that more. I'm eager to explore what are the principles and what are the analyses that actually make solidarity happen in an effective way and in a long-term way. And so I think learning that and understanding that will perhaps shape itself into a curriculum or case studies and perhaps a book at some point as well. But for me, the question really is, as we move towards the America of 2042, what is the country that we are building towards? How do we course correct? Because we need to be course correcting right now in many ways. How do we build unity and cross-group solidarity? And how do we really understand equity and inclusion and make sure that our policies and practices and institutions are reflective of those values that I think we all hold?